مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بدأ عهد ترامب، وإن كان أحدا قد شك أننا توينا صفحة في تاريخ السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، فما عليه سوى الاستماع إلا خطاب تنصيب الرئيس الجديد، ولن توجد ذكرا للقواعد والقيم الدولية أو الأمن الجماعي أو حقوق الإنسان حول العالم. أهم كلمتين كانتا تقرير الرئيس لشعار الحملة المثير للمشاعر أمريكا أولاً. بطبيعة الحال تؤلي كل دولة مصالحها الخاصة، فماذا ستعني سياسة الرئيس ترامب من الناحية العملية؟ كيف سيترجم هو ووزير الخارجية الجديد رئيس إكسون السابق، وهي أكبر شركات الطاقة في العالم، مبدأ أمريكا أولاً إلى أفكار عملية؟ ماذا سيعني أمريكا أولاً بالنسبة للتعاطي مع روسيا والصين والتصدي لإيران والقضاء على الدولة الإسلامية والقيادة الأمريكية لتحالف عالمي من الديمقراطيات الليبرالية؟ لمناقشة هذه الأسئلة الملحة يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We're sitting here with our panel of foreign policy experts to discuss foreign policy under our new president, Donald Trump. What do we know? What don't we know? And where are we heading? Gentlemen, welcome to 2017 and the new administration.
Thank you, Rob.
Let's begin with his first day in office, the inaugural address. And a powerful statement about America in the world, America first. What does this say to you? What does it say to our allies? What does it say to our adversaries? Juan, you want to start?
Yeah, I think it was wholly consistent with what President Trump was saying during the campaign, that he was going to return American policy both domestically and abroad into an American first strategy, which does have the ring of isolationism with respect to trade, with respect to military policy, with respect to rethinking alliances. And I think it's a little bit disconcerting, no doubt, to friends and allies abroad, not quite understanding what America first actually means in translation. And so I think the first impression is it's entirely consistent with what we've heard from President Trump. But what is troubling, perhaps, especially to friends and allies, is not understanding quite what America first means. Does this mean a more aggressive foreign policy at times in a unilateral sense? Does it mean rethinking and reshaping current alliances, as with NATO or in East Asia? Does it mean rupturing with the current balance of trade around the world? You saw later the pullout from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, questions about NAFTA and tension with Mexico. So America first sounds good from a political perspective, no doubt, for President Trump and his followers. But at the same time, it creates uncertainty in the international landscape that no doubt the Trump administration is going to have to fill out and explain further.
Now, Dennis, President Trump said countries follow their self-interest, and we will do that, and we expect others. This, at one level, is obvious. So why should America first be so provocative?
Well, because it sounds as if everything is going to be interpreted in a kind of dollars and cents equation. And if it turns out that our relationship with you doesn't serve our kind of very narrow definition of interest, well then basically if you're an ally, good luck to you. We're going to do what's in our interest, and maybe doing what's in your interest doesn't serve us, even if you've been a traditional ally, even if we have an alliance relationship with you. So I think apropos of what Juan was saying, it's unsettling. The definition of America first sounds like a very narrow definition. It sounds as if values don't count for anything. It sounds as if the approach to interests is going to be defined through such a narrow prism that it has a kind of exclusionary quality to it. So for those who have counted on the United States because they feel there's a commitment, for those who have looked to the United States to be a kind of moral beacon to the world, there's no sense of that. In fact, quite the opposite. You had the sense that values and morality isn't going to be a factor at all when it comes to America's approach to the world. Instead, what is going to be a factor is, does this, in a narrow sense, benefit the United States? And if it doesn't, well, then good luck to you.
Well, I was just going to say, what's also interesting about this is there are real echoes of President Obama's foreign policy to a certain extent. The notion of we're going to concentrate on nation building at home. There's going to be a recalibration of where our interests are, and frankly, reliance on allies to do more to serve their own interests. And so, in an interesting way, there's kind of a link there to President Obama and what has been perceived to be a retreat from American leadership around the world, while at the same time, a lot of allies, especially in the Middle East, are seeing and hoping a more aggressive American foreign policy. And so it suggests that this is sort of an open vessel as to what America first means, frankly, what a President Trump foreign policy means, because at one point it could be very isolationist, very disruptive. On the other hand, it could be very welcoming to certain allies. So it's a little bit of both, actually.
What's interesting is that President Obama was an internationalist in a way that President Trump is not, but President Obama was a minimalist. And he defined what we would do internationally in minimalist terms. The notion of leading from behind became kind of an image that was seen by the rest of the world as America retreating from its responsibilities. In the Middle East, there is a combination of hope that he'll be stronger and not reluctant the way President Obama was, but uncertainty as to, well, will he really define this area as being in America's interest or not?
While there may be some continuity with President Obama and President Trump, it didn't take long in his inaugural address for him to state very clearly that the target was radical Islamic extremism.
True.
He ran on a platform of critiquing President Obama for failing to call the enemy, and he did it right away.
Yeah, right.
Do we read anything into this, and how do you think that will filter out into policies? How do you think our adversaries and allies will interpret this? Dennis?
Here's, I would say, and here's a sense of irony, I think. In the Middle East, I think there's actually a kind of welcoming of that, because it suggests that this president actually sees the threats as they are, and he isn't afraid to label them for what they are. You know, the irony is that President Obama was reluctant to use the word Islamist because he thought that it was implying we were declaring war on Islam. For those in the Middle East who know what an Islamist is and see it as a threat to them, they saw that as an indication of a kind of political correctness that also showed a fear of being overly provocative against the very forces that were a threat. So here, I think, ironically, you may find in the Middle East a sense that this is a good sign that he really does see the threats as they are, and he's not going to retreat in the face of some kind of political correctness.
Interesting.
I think that's right. I think it also suggests that it is an opening to a more aggressive posture in the Middle East, use of American forces, American resources, support to allies against Daesh or ISIL, against manifestations of the ideology. But also, to Dennis's point, to begin to ask questions about what is the Muslim Brotherhood, right? You've begun to see the debate again here in the United States as to what political Islam means in the context of the threat. And so it begins to open the aperture around those debates, which I think will be welcome in places like the UAE and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, but does open up a realm of debate that you haven't seen in American policy circles for some time for precisely the reasons Dennis has mentioned. The other thing I'll just note quickly was less the sort of use of the term, because we know that this is a term he used. He wanted to demonstrate a break from the Obama administration, but it's what he said he was going to do, which was the elimination of violent Islamic radicalization and extremism. The elimination of the extremism is an incredibly ambitious goal. Some would argue not possible when you're talking about an underlying ideology and its various manifestations. So the fact that he's placed that marker as a goal, the actual elimination of this threat, in an ideological context, raises a lot of interesting and difficult questions for a new administration.
So it's not just destroy ISIL, it's destroy the entire ideology, the entire manifestation of extremism.
Exactly, and that's a fundamental break from the Obama administration, which came in after the Bush administration to narrow the scope. In fact, they said explicitly, we're not talking about a war of ideas, we're talking about going after core Al-Qaeda. And they redefined the strategy and the lexicon around the narrowing of the scope. What President Trump has done, and no doubt his advisors are doing, is trying to open the scope again. That means it's not just Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but it's the ideology and its manifestations.
Look, it's a challenge that may be bigger than they understand. And it does have implications, because if you're going to destroy an idea, well, then you have to have a competing idea. And it's not clear right now that the administration has developed the competing idea, number one. Number two, it really does mean you better be careful about joining with the Russians, because the Russians at this point have been doing a lot to abet Iranian power. Well, if you want to go ahead and defeat the idea, joining with the Iranians even indirectly ends up making it very difficult to defeat that idea, because in a sense the Iranians deep in sectarianism. That makes it much harder to draw the Sunnis into this battle. We need the Sunnis to be the ones to discredit the idea. We can't discredit that ideology, but they can. So it has a set of implications, and we will see whether the administration, as it develops itself, fully understands what is required in that strategy.
And critically, the question of whether or not Assad and his regime remains in place is critical to this as well, because we know it's a driver for radicalization. It's an attractive dimension of these radical groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others that are manifesting, and so it implicates these core thorny questions for the administration.
All right, so far we've only talked just about the inaugural address. So when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about the lessons and what we can look into appointments that President Trump has made in the foreign policy realm, and early decisions that he has made, and foreign leaders that he seems to have embraced as early partners in the new administration. In just a moment. Our panel of foreign policy experts includes Juan Zarate. Juan is one of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts. He is the chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network, the senior national security analyst for NBC News, and a visiting lecturer of law at Harvard Law School. He's highly sought because of his exemplary public service as Deputy Assistant to President George W. Bush and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. Previously, he was the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. Also with us is Ambassador Dennis Ross, my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In President Obama's administration, he spent 3 years, first in the State Department advising Hillary Clinton, and then at the White House as Senior Director for the Central Region on the National Security Council. Dennis has a quarter-century experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. All right, gentlemen, you've both been appointed by presidents to major positions. Let's take a look at President Trump's appointments. What can we read by appointments as Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense? What message is he sending? What image is he trying to project? Dennis?
Well, I think a couple of things. First, I'm kind of struck by a degree of diversity. I don't mean in terms of the demography of his and sociology of his appointments, but in a sense, these are people whose views may not completely accord with his own, which actually I think is a good thing, because it suggests that there isn't going to be an echo chamber around him and he's going to be challenged, and that's an important thing for a president. So someone like the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, he's been very clear already on his attitudes on torture, as an example. He's been very clear about how he looks at the Russians, which seems to be quite different from the way that the president is describing his view of Putin. He's been very clear about what has to be done vis-a-vis Iran. He's been very clear about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, not being a perfect agreement, not being one that he necessarily thought was without flaws, but one that he felt should not be torn up.
Dennis, do you have any view on the idea that so far the National Security Council, where you've served before, will have quite a few military veterans, military officers, non-political, professional? Is this an advantage? Is this a detriment? What's the implication of this?
I have to say, my experience in working with people who spent their careers in the military was a very favorable one. I mean, first, I found consistently people of the highest caliber, number one. Number two, I saw people who had a kind of selflessness to them. I also saw people with a very strong kind of code. And so I feel actually the military presence, I don't see it as somehow increasing the potential for a militarist foreign policy. In fact, oftentimes I found the military among the most sober in terms of how you thought about the use of the military instrument. I do see it as creating, ironically, a kind of discipline. That's not what this president is known for, a kind of creating a kind of discipline. And it gets to Juan's point, you've got a lot of appointments. You have people who we still don't know are going to fill out the number 2 and number 3 positions. And that is a little bit of concern to me because it's pretty unusual to have an administration already ensconced and not have those appointments already made. And that, I think, raises questions about how quickly this administration can get its bearings and establish a kind of logical approach to decision making. But I find the military presence to be something that I think actually is a good sign with a president who isn't known for his discipline.
Okay, let's move on. Juan, the president's already made some major decisions in just his early days. Border security, building the wall, limitations on refugees coming in from a handful of Middle Eastern states, withdrawing from the Asian trade deal. When you put it all together, what lessons do you draw from the direction of foreign policy?
Well, I think there are maybe 3 that I draw from this. One, these are wholly consistent and predictable actions. These are the core sort of pillars of what candidate Trump had promised to do as president. And we've seen over the course of the last sort of 2 presidencies that what we've seen promised in the political campaign translates very quickly into executive action and orders. You saw this with President Obama, for example, with the closure of Guantanamo. Day 1, signing the order of the closure within a year, right? And we know what happened there. Right. And so there's become sort of this quickening of the pace of foreign policy coming from the campaign. So entirely predictable in that regard. Second, I think it appears to me, and this goes to Dennis's point about understanding the philosophy and the decision-making of this administration, that this is an administration that is actually fundamentally committed to disruption. Like they're willing to actually rupture with the norms of foreign policy, of trade, of bilateral engagement in a way that is, for Trump supporters, very heartening. For those in the foreign policy domain and certainly allies abroad, disconcerting to a certain extent. But there is a theme of disruption and a little bit as well with personnel choices. So that's another key. The third element is a question that I have with respect to all of these things, which is whether or not there is enough strategic thinking about what comes next. Because all of this is predictable, all of this is disruptive, but the real question for the president and the country is, do we have a strategy in mind to follow up, for example, the pullout from TPP? What then is the reaction with key allies around the world, and how do you deal with China perhaps taking advantage of that trade vacuum? What about the context and the tension with Mexico? What is the end game here with Mexico, a key ally, a key trading partner, one with which we don't want to be in tension or war, but what is the end state if there is going to be this tension? So the question of the strategic end state is a really open question for me, and so that's, I think, what suggests to me.
Dennis, regrettably, we're running out of time. So what's your key observation from the early decisions?
I would pick up on the 2 things that Juan said. disruption for its own sake has a certain value on a very short-term basis. Unpredictability has a certain value as well because it makes others cautious, at least initially. But unpredictability also inevitably creates problems for us as well because it makes friends and foes, in a sense, adopt positions that we may not want them to adopt because they don't know exactly what we're going to do. So I would like to see, after the initial effort at disruption, I'd like to see a clear game plan of what the administration actually wants to achieve.
Okay, very good. Gentlemen, we're going to come back at our next discussion, talk about who President Trump has been meeting with and what his early priorities really portend for American foreign policy out into the full administration. Thank you for joining us this week on Dakhel, Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول أثر أمريكا أولاً على سياسة الولايات المتحدة في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.